First, I want to make sure that everyone can hear me throughout my talk. If anyone cannot hear me at any time during my talk, please raise your hand. I first came to Puebla in the 1970s, and at that time, I was a hippie. I was searching the world to try to find myself. I'm very grateful to Andrus and to the City of Ideas to have invited me back here. I can tell you that Puebla is just as beautiful as when I was here before, and it is richer. I am not as beautiful, but I am cleaner. I can also tell you that my greatest pleasure in returning here is to see so many people like me who are searching for ideas. Now, at this point, I think we can say that the City of Ideas is a big success. And I want to tell you why it's a big success, because I know. And that's because I know Andrus Romer. It's not a big success just because he's a good organizer. That's not the main thing. It's a big success because the City of Ideas is an expression of who Andrus Romer is. And that's a very important point that I'm going to return to in my talk. Now, imagine this experiment. You say to a child, would you like to have 1 candy bar on Saturday or 2 candy bars on Sunday? And you ask the child this question on Monday. My slide isn't working. This is crucial. Yes, you ask on Monday, and he says, I'll have 2 candy bars on Sunday and none on Saturday. You ask him on Tuesday, he says, I'll have 2 on Sunday. You ask him on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, he says, I'll have 2. You ask him on Saturday, he says, I'll have the 1 right now. Now, why is that? Well, Oscar Wilde said, I can resist everything except temptation. Now, this property, what are you saying? All right. That's all right. Okay, good. Yeah. Now, this characteristic is not just one of children. Many of you are students, and students are susceptible to a particular kind of illness. It's called Saturday night fever. I'm sure that some of you get Saturday night fever, and here's an example of how Saturday night fever works. On Monday, you say, would I like to have 1 beer on Saturday or 12? And on Monday, you say 1. On Tuesday, you say 1. On Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, you say 1. And on Saturday, you drink 12. Now, the proof that you have had Saturday night fever is when you wake up on Sunday morning and you say, I can't believe what I did last night. I'm sure none of you have had this experience, but you probably know others who have. Now, the emotions of people have a certain tendency to change over time. In young people, there's a lot of up and down. In older people, the emotional ups and downs during a week would be less. And of course, when you're heading where I'm going, it just goes flat. Yes, there we are, it goes flat. So the problem of controlling your emotions, of controlling your desires, is particularly strong when you're young, and you have to have ways of dealing with it. Now, there's a name for this problem of controlling your desires, and the Greeks called it akrasia. when they spoke of akrasia, they talked about the weakness of will. It's the weakness of will that prevents your reason from controlling your desires. There's great discussions by Socrates, by Aristotle on this problem that are still very much worth reading. Now, there have also been more modern developments. In psychology, this problem is now called hyperbolic discounting. You know, discounting means that a future dollar is not worth as much as a present dollar. We discount the future. And hyperbolic discounting means that the difference between Saturday and Sunday gets really big when Saturday arrives. That's what is called hyperbolic discounting. And the psychologists have studied this phenomenon in people, but also in animals. It's a very basic characteristic. Economists who have recently turned to this problem call it time inconsistent preferences. And what they focus on is the fact that if you make a plan on what you're going to do on Saturday, and you make the plan on Monday, and then you make it on Tuesday, you have the same plan. On Wednesday, you have the same plan. Then Saturday comes and you change your plan. That's because your planning is not consistent over time. And if you suffer from weakness of will, then you will not be able to plan consistently over time. Now, there are some things that are like ice and water, in that ice is hard and water is liquid. They don't look the same, but they really are the same. And I want to talk about something that's like the problem of controlling your desires that doesn't seem the same, but it is the same because the most basic social strategy for dealing with it is the same. Let me give you an example of a joke I heard in Russia when I was a young man. This is the joke of the two commissars, the commissar of steel and the commissar of coal. And one day, the commissar of steel met the commissar of coal while walking along the bank of the Moscow River. And the commissar of steel said, "Where are you going, comrade?" And the commissar of coal replied, "To Leningrad." So Steele thought, he says that he's going to Leningrad because he wants me to think that he's going to Minsk. But I know that he's really going to Leningrad. So he said, "You're lying." This is, I'm having technical problems. There we go. This is what happened. We don't need to go into what happened. That this picture shows what happened to the commissar of coal. Now, the point of this account is that we really need to coordinate our activities, like producing steel requires coal. And as a consequence, we need to be able to rely on what other people say. We need to believe that they will do what they say. Now, we don't have a lie detector in our body like Pinocchio's nose. If we had a lie detector like Pinocchio's nose, this would be an easy problem. We've tried to build lie detectors. There's an Indian tribe that I've worked with, and in their courthouse, they have a picture of a person testifying in the traditional way of the Warm Springs tribes. And that was when you testified in court, you had to hold your hand in a bowl of water. And that's because if you were lying, you'd be a little nervous, and you might make ripples on the water. And of course, that's the same basis of the polygraph or the lie detector, which is a modern device to try to see the ripples, which show whether a person is or is not lying. But the lie detector is not very successful. It's also not the case that people walk around wired to lie detectors. We need a much better more effective way of getting people to do what they say. And that's, to explain what that is, I want to imagine that you go into a restaurant and the waiter says to you, would you like menu A or would you like menu B? And you say, well, what's on menu A? And the person says, well, on menu A there's salad. Okay, what's on menu B? Well, on menu B we have all of those salads, but we also have hamburgers. Now, you might say to yourself, it's always better to have more choice rather than less. Of course you should ask for menu B because it has everything on that menu A has and more, so you have more to choose from. But then you might say to yourself, but wait a minute, I really ought to eat the salad. I really shouldn't eat the hamburger. So I'm going to make a commitment to eating the salad by asking for menu A. I'll ask for menu A and then I can't order the hamburger. So one of the ways that we control our weakness of will is that we make commitments. This is a quote from Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War. It's one of the great works of social science, and it was written in the 6th century BC. And the quote is, when your army has crossed the border into enemy territory, you should burn your boats and bridges in order to make it clear to everybody that you have no hankering after home. That's the first use of burning your bridges that I know of. And of course, if you burn your bridges, you make a commitment. And the way you make a commitment is you make it difficult, more costly, perhaps impossible to retreat. You must go forward with your plan. So, when you commit, what you're doing is you're getting rid of some of your freedom. It's like choosing menu A and not menu B. It's like burning your bridges. You deliberately destroy some of your freedom. You handcuff yourself. Now, one of the classic examples of this in literature is the story of Ulysses. You know, Ulysses was returning after the Trojan War, and his boat had to go past the rock where the beautiful siren fishwomen sang their songs. And when they sang their songs, they were so attractive that the boats turned to them and crashed in the rocks. And Ulysses asked his crew to tie him to the mast so that he would be committed to not changing the course of the boat. And then he filled their ears with wax so they couldn't hear the singing, but he could. So he got to hear the singing, and he committed to getting home safely from the Trojan Wars. Now, when you commit, how do you commit in a case like that of the Saturday Night Fever example? How do you commit to having one beer instead of 12, or even better, not having any at all? Well, you have to do something to raise the price, to raise the cost of your having the 12 beers. And one way that you might do that in many countries of the world is that you might ask to be the designated driver. Because the designated driver is the person who's not going to take a drink, and everyone else is relying on him. If you take a drink and then you drive, you could be in big trouble, and your friends don't want you to do that. So as a consequence, you can commit to not drinking the 12 beers by being the designated driver. The way that we most often commit, we people, is a little bit different from other species. In chimpanzees, they practice reciprocity. One animal cleans the fur of the other, and in return, the other one cleans the first one's fur. This is a grooming line. But in people, we more often make a promise. Here we have two friends, very sophisticated friends, shaking hands, as you can see, shaking hands in a special way that to show that they have made a promise to each other that they're going to keep. And if that promise is enforceable, then we have something really interesting, which is illustrated by the difference between Napoleon of France and George III of England. In the early 1800s, they fought a long war against each other. And part of the outcome of the war was determined by who could raise the most money to fight it. Now, Napoleon could not sell his bonds in the Paris Bourse because he was a dictator who was above the law. George III could sell his bonds in London because he was a constitutional monarch who was subject to the law. So by giving up some of his freedom, George III was more powerful. In Silicon Valley, where I have started a company and where I've worked and researched, this problem of trust between an investor and an innovator often comes up. The problem is the investor has money, and he's afraid that the innovator will steal his money. And the innovator has an idea, and he's afraid the investor will steal his idea. How do they succeed in cooperating with each other? How do they overcome their distrust? Well, they start with cheap talk. They talk to each other about various things. They sign non-disclosure agreements. They blab away for a while, and then it gets serious. And when it gets serious, they sign documents. And these documents are enforceable contracts. Much of the creativity of Silicon Valley comes from the creativity of its contracts. The contracts in Silicon Valley are just as innovative as the pieces of technology that are produced there. In the case of my own company, for example, our lawyers provided all of the legal services that we needed in the first 2 years of our existence in exchange for stock and no cash. That was a special contract which would be against the law in most countries of the world. The solution in Silicon Valley is a co-ownership system whereby each one finds that it's in his best interest to cooperate with the other. Now, you might think that where people keep their promises under the law, that it's going to make them wealthier. And there is a relationship that's easy to show between the rule of law, which is measured by a body in the World Bank, and the gross national product per capita of a country. This graph shows it. There is no country in the world that has a high income per capita and does not also measure well on the rule of law index produced by the World Bank. And there are many countries who are very poor who do very badly in that relationship. One of the indicators of the problem is the delay it takes to enforce a suit. Here I give you some data from the World Bank on the difference in the number of days it takes to enforce a suit in different countries, arranged into short delays, medium delays, and long delays. As you can see, Mexico is placed squarely in the middle. Russia and China are anomalies because it takes very little time to get your case decided in court, but the quality of the decision is terrible. Now, we've had a meltdown in our financial system in this fall, and that meltdown is a consequence of a number of things. It's partly a consequence of the fact that the left-wing Democrats forced the banks to loan to poor people who were not reliable and could not be expected to repay. The right-wing Republicans allowed the banks to borrow more money and take greater risk. That's a second cause. And a third cause is in the market itself, where the contracts failed. The contracts to allocate the risk didn't work. It was a failure in our contractual system. So I think this was a case where the investment bankers were not committed to reducing their risk in the way that was in the best interest of the people with whom they had contracted. Well, I have to conclude, without freedom, we are slaves. Without commitment, we're oysters. We open our shells and we take whatever drifts past. To have plans, we have to make commitment. To be human beings and not oysters, we have to have plans and goals. So, what we should do then is to create legal institutions that enable people to make commitments so that they can in fact do what they say, and people can rely upon them to do so. That's at the level of public policy. At the level of personal behavior, I think that it's important to understand that when you make a commitment, you are reducing your freedom. And you should make sure that when you reduce your freedom, you do it in ways that express who you are, so that instead of stifling who you are, your commitments make you become the best person that you can be. Life is a chessboard. Be careful about your commitments.